Disclaimer.
Hey, did you guys know that analyzing stuff is really hard? There's so much jargon and needlessly complex phraseology going on that sometimes it makes analyzing things according to theory extremely annoying and needlessly frustrating. Now, being a half-semester grad school dropout, I like to think that I have a pretty good grasp on some of these ideas, and if not, I got a little bit of help for this one. And speaking of... Hey, did you get around to reading that script I sent you?
Hey, when are you gonna get back to work? You went off on your break 2 hours ago. I can read it as soon as you help me stock shelves like you said you would 10 minutes ago.
Okay, so we're just gonna skadoosh that option away. Anyway, I really wanted to get into analysis for a recent movie I really loved. You already read the title, so let's just get into it. Let's talk about Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Portrait of a Lady on Fire is a 2019 French romantic drama set around the end of the 18th century, written and directed by Céline Sciamma. In it, a painter named Marianne, played by Noémie Merlan, is hired to paint the wedding portrait of Eloise, played by Adèle Haenel, who's described as being a difficult subject, and the women discover more about their true selves as they grow closer, culminating in a passionate climax. Since this exploration is full of spoilers, I suggest you go and watch this movie if you haven't seen it already. While this movie is a slow burn, pun intended, it's one of the better romance films I've seen in years, with a beautiful color palette thanks to it being shot in 4K. But I'm not here to talk about technical achievements. I'm here to talk about the thing that fuels the entire story of The Portrait of a Lady on Fire: desire. What's made this film such a great entry in the romance genre is Sciamma's script. Sciamma understands that great romance fiction is not about the pairing itself, but it's about the tense anticipation of the courtship. Much of that tension comes from the situation all the characters are in. Heloise has earned the label of difficult model by the lady of the house because she doesn't want to be captured in a portrait. When the lady of the house, Eloise's mother, played by Valeria Golino, divulges these details to Marianne, there's two important details to note about the Countess. Firstly, Eloise's mother is the one pushing for the portrait to be made in the first place. Since she's a woman in a position of power, she holds bearing over the fate of her daughter. With this power, she's choosing to control Heloise's fate, using her authority to cement society's grip over women's autonomy. The second big detail is the way Heloise's mother describes her own wedding portrait. She talks about her own portrait with a hint of forlorn sadness. This implies that Eloise's mother was in the same position that she's putting her own daughter into, forcing a marriage born from elitist expectation instead of love. By putting her daughter through the same process that she likely went through in her own youth, the lady of the house all but guarantees a vicious cycle of arranged marriages and heartbreak. Naturally, Eloise completely opposes this. She wants the liberty to do what she wants, when she wants, without the judgment of the world around her. Within the world of her own house, she's told that she's going to be married off to some man from Milan that she's never even met. She knows nothing about this man, so she has no reason to care about him. She wants to go off and sing and go to Sunday Mass to hear music, since that's the only place where she can enjoy art. It's in secrecy that she can start expressing herself on her own terms to both Marianne and us, the audience. Eloise reveals that her passion for the arts is what led her to live in a convent and consider becoming a nun, since she claims that nuns have a quote-unquote surprising amount of freedom. When you compare Eloise's restrictive lifestyle devoid of autonomy to that of a nun, who are permitted liberties like libraries of books and access to music, in addition to the vows of chastity that would forbid her from being married off, you can see why the lifestyle of a nun appeals to her. In this context, where we would expect the lifestyle of a nun to be very restrictive, to Heloise it's actually liberating. Technically speaking, Marianne has a little bit more freedom than her subject. She's been trained in her father's profession, and she's permitted to travel on her own. Despite this, she's still in a similar position of being controlled like her subject. However, due to the sensibilities of her employer and the quote-unquote difficulty of her subject, she has to paint Heloise in secret. And by painting in secret, Marianne must capture Eloise's essence the way she's expected to look, as the portrait of a model wife-to-be. Thus, Marianne must absorb as much detail of her as possible as she accompanies her subject on walks, sketching in secret, and later using herself as a model to fill in the blanks. This takes us to the subject of the gaze. To grossly oversimplify a huge piece of theory jargon, The gaze is basically the act of observing and or being observed. Naturally, this act can have a vast variety of social implications. Guys like Jacques Lacan have defined the gaze under a psychoanalytical lens as being self-aware of being observed and its psychological effects, such as a state of anxiety over the loss of autonomy, which comes with the judgment of the gaze. The gaze is the subject of plenty of theory and analysis since it can relate to the ideas of how the self can be affected by the power dynamics present in the judgments that come from other people's perceptions of the self. But most of you are probably most familiar with the term the male gaze. Coined by film theorist Laura Mulvey, simply put, the male gaze defines the gaze under the context of gender studies as the use of the gaze by masculine heterosexual perspectives to represent women as objects of sexual gratification. The most common example of this concept is Megan Fox's character in those Transformer movies. Notice how her character is dressed and posed, the way the camera eyes her up and down as she engages with the car, a symbol of what men are stereotyped as taking interest in. So if there's a male gaze, then clearly there should be a female gaze, and you'd be correct. In fact, Sciamma intended to use this movie to explore the idea of the feminine gaze. However, because this concept is so sparsely talked about, we have almost no framework for the feminine gaze when compared to that of the male gaze.
I think there's a male gaze, and so there is a female gaze.
By definition, yeah.
But I think we should be talking about the male gaze mostly because we, as female, has been growing in that world. I've been raised by in a heterosexual world, and so my imaginary is heterosexual. I mean, and so I know male gaze by heart. I've been defined, I've been moved by male gaze, been excited by male gaze. So we're in the position, or we can be anything as female, because as an audience and as artists, because we know both worlds. We have our experiences. There is no female imaginary because there is not been that many. There's not a corpus. There's not been that many female artists, so that we can say there's this female imaginary. But women have been imagined by men, so they're in charge of our images.
So what is the female gaze? To some, it's just the opposite of the male gaze but applied to the female sex. However, this definition is very narrow-minded and focuses on reinforcing sex and gender binaries. Meanwhile, others, such as theorist Judith Butler, have proposed the feminine gaze as a presence which forces men to self-regulate their behavior. However, neither of these definitions are very useful for our analysis of this movie, so we're going to stick to the main broad concept of the gaze for the rest of this analysis. The wedding portrait of Eloise is more than just capturing the image of the bride-to-be, but it's a literal exchange of a woman as an object through marriage. The man from Milan being given this portrait of his wife is no different than the man from Milan being given Eloise herself. Thus, the lack of consent regarding the marriage carries over to her objection to model for the painting. The act of capturing Eloise as a painting takes away her agency to define herself on her own terms, because she's being filtered through someone else's perspective through the gaze. Since, like most women of the 18th century, Eloise isn't given the freedom to express every part of herself to the world, an outsider's perspective will never be a true portrait of her. Combine this with how Marianne Frankensteined the painting of her subject together, and you find the depth of the power behind Eloise's declaration regarding the first portrait.
Vous ne dites rien?
C'est moi?
Oui.
Vous me voyez comme ça?
Il ne s'agit pas que de moi.
Comment ça, il ne s'agit pas que de vous?
Il y a des règles, des conventions, des idées.
Vous voulez dire qu'il n'y a pas de vie? Pas de présence?
Votre présence est faite d'états passagers, d'aspects momentanés, cela peut aussi manquer de vérité.
Tout n'est pas passager. Certains sentiments sont profonds. Que cela ne soit pas proche de moi, c'est quelque chose que je peux comprendre. Mais que cela ne soit pas proche de vous, voilà qui est triste.
This is when Marianne realizes she's focused more on completing a job expected from her, rather than creating art of Eloise for the sake of art or for her passion of the craft. The way society has gagged their freedom of expression is best symbolized by the scarves they wear over their mouths during their walks. They're unable to speak the truth of who they really are until they're at the edge of the civilization which denies them. That's where they don't have to worry about being muzzled. The only place the women in this film can feel comfortable as themselves is in secrecy, by cliffsides and shorelines or in hidden alcoves, and, on the rare occasion, among fellow women in a sorority atmosphere. After all, what else are you supposed to do when the lady of the house leaves? You do everything you're told not to do. You sing around the bonfire, you drink a little too much wine, have a secret abortion, have a little lesbian romance, you know, girls' night. It's within these settings that both Marianne and Eloise can finally be their true selves, and it's once the pair can lower their defenses and be themselves that Eloise submits herself to Marianne as her muse. When Eloise catches Marianne sketching her while she slept, she continues to pose, not only consenting to be captured through Marianne's gaze, but desiring to see how she's viewed by her partner. This is ultimately what Eloise wanted. She wanted to dictate her life by her own rules and her own desires and her own consent, rather than what the world wants from her. This is what led her to consider becoming a nun, and it's why she cherishes what little time she gets with Marianne as her lover. It's the liberty to choose that she desires. Of course, they both know the sad truth that their romance is destined to be split apart by the world which denies them, and yet, the art born from their romance lives on. Once the pair separate, there's little they can do to express their true selves in public, save for the subtle innuendo for those in the know. However, Marianne does get one rare chance to use her gaze in a way that few get to in their lifetime. Up until this point, the entire narrative has been a product of Marianne's perspective and her gaze. However, in the final scene, at the theater where Eloise fails to notice her former lover, Marianne gets to see the relationship through the eyes of Eloise. This new perspective is a rare show of emotion that's rarely experienced in the presence of someone else. As the memories flood over her face, we get a glimpse into Eloise's gaze, the highs, the lows, and the raw emotion that came with their relationship. And for the most part, that's a good chunk of what this film is about. It's about both the longing and want to be with someone and to have control over your own fate. And because of this message, I feel like this film is extremely universal. So while this exploration might have been a little bit brief, this is a really big part of the movie I want to talk about with you guys. So anyway, if you've spent any time on YouTube, you know the drill at this point. Leave a like or dislike to tell me what you thought, leave a comment down below, subscribe for more content, hit the bell for notifications, and hopefully I'll see you around in the next video.